John Hook's Newsmaker starts now.
Thanks for joining us on Newsmaker. I'm Ellen McNamara in for John Hook. What a week on Wall Street. It closed on a high on Friday with anticipation that a rate cut is finally coming. So what does it mean for the housing market here in the Valley? I'll talk with a housing expert in just a moment. But we begin with our battleground state. Winning the independent vote is crucial to victory in the fall. To talk more about the crucial group, ASU professor Thom Reilly is here now. Tom, thanks so much for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
And you study this group, and I think it's just fascinating because there are so many independents, so many unaffiliated with a party here in our state.
Yeah, so nationally, last month, Gallup, that tracks political affiliation for the last 60, 70 years, independents or unaffiliates hit a high point at 51% of those that identified themselves as independent or unaffiliated. It's not how they vote, not necessarily how they register, but in Arizona, we're kind of a leader in those that actually have registered as unaffiliated. And the unaffiliated vote has kind of been neck and neck with the Republican vote. If you count about 1.5% of the small parties, unaffiliates actually edge out Republicans. Yeah. So we could safely say that the independent bloc is the largest voting bloc in the state of Arizona.
Yeah, I mean, that is true. It's 33% not affiliated with any party as of right now. 29% Democrats.
About 35% Republican.
Right. But then it is really fascinating. Talk about who an independent is, because I have this idea in my mind, and I think a lot of people do, that it is an older person who, for whatever reason, doesn't like either party. A lot of people have the perception it might be a veteran, for example. But what have you found in your studies?
Well, it runs the political gamut. So, some people who are independent feel that parties are not partisan enough.
Right.
Many people describe it perhaps as a bell curve, or more, center in the center, or a bit more moderate. But they also span the spectrum of ages. But if we look at who are most likely to identify as independent as young people, it's Gen Z and millennials. So nationally, they have represent about 52% identify as independent. We did a survey recently of Gen Z voters, about 1,400, and 50% of them were registered as independents, which is pretty significant. So yeah, young people are distinctly independent. And if we look at their next generation, millennials, they don't seem to be joining parties, right? So this trend of staying unaffiliated, I think underpins how we view politics. It's always been a two-party lens between Republicans and Democrats.
Right.
But as we see the larger number of individuals leaving the two parties and identifying as unaffiliated, we have to look at things differently.
And how do you reach those young people? I mean, I know, especially this campaign, we're seeing a lot on social media. We're seeing, a lot of information on TikTok. Is that where these young independents are getting their information?
Yeah, so when we ask them, the registered voters, where they get their information, it's predominantly social media. Almost 60%, TikTok being the leader in the social media realm. But they do look at online news sources. So in the focus groups I did when I talked to young people, they tend to get be introduced to concepts or ideas on TikTok, but it doesn't mean they don't Google, they don't look at other fact check sources in order to ensure that what they're reading is correct.
Is an independent, especially if they're a younger person, are they educated? I mean, are they college educated?
Yeah, so they as I said, kind of represent the entire spectrum. Independents in general, span the spectrum of those with PhDs to those that don't have degrees. What separates them from partisans is that, we know nationally, we know in Arizona how 95% of Republicans are going to vote and Democrats vote.
And even if they don't like the candidate, if they hate the candidate, they're still going to vote for
it. It didn't move the needle.
Right.
But with independents, they're notoriously unpredictable. So, we looked at independent voting over a 20-year period to look at voting patterns, and there's no loyalty to party. They move in and out of independent status. So that makes predicting their vote really challenging. If we look at kind of national trends towards independence went for Obama by 8 percentage points. Trump by 4 percentage points, Biden by 13 percentage points.
Wow.
In January, they're trending towards Trump at 10, and now they seem to be trending towards Harris by 4 2 to 4%.
Wow.
So it's a wide swing. So kind of figuring out how they vote on issues is a real challenge.
Unpredictable, and also not necessarily, they don't have an allegiance probably, right? I mean, obviously, clearly they're an independent.
They don't. And, you know,
they're easily swayed by that.
Well, you know, some are leaners. So some, you know, basically identify as an independent, but perhaps would lead towards Republican, Democrats. Some of the research suggests they're embarrassed to tell people they're part of the parties, which I think is really interesting. But many of them just fundamentally feel that the two parties have been too polarized, and that they have left. And that doesn't mean they're uninformed. It doesn't mean they don't have strong convictions. But they basically, you know, are looking at things differently than the two-party system.
Do you feel like they will decide this election here in our state? I
think they do. You know, so when I looked at independent voting patterns in here in Arizona, independents here in nationally tend to underperform at the primary level. You know, that makes a lot of sense, particularly if you have closed primaries or if you have semi-open. So, you know, in Arizona, you can vote in the primary if you're unaffiliated, but you have to pull a ballot. Very confusing. So voting participation is around 20%. But if we look at exit polling in 2022, Edison exit polling, they had independent vote almost at 40%. So they seem to overperform in the general election.
Wow.
So, you know, what we learned from the primary perhaps doesn't tell us a lot because the independent vote wasn't there. And it's, you know, one of the key factors is why Arizona continues to be a purple state, a swing state.
Right. And that's the thing. I mean, our primary system is set up the way that it is. But, I mean, even to take one other step, it does weed some people out, frankly.
And it's confusing. You know, if you ask people just about whether they can vote, you know, because they can't vote for the federal presidential preference, which is even more confusing.
The presidential preference one is so confusing, and you're like, well, you're still going to have the primary. I mean, why not just do it during the primary?
Well, of course, there is a ballot initiative on open primaries that would open that up and allow, you know, everyone to vote without having to be part of a party. So that may change things. But yeah, you know, I think that what's happening here in Arizona and nationally is that, you know, the parties need to look at, you know, are they becoming so polarized it's a turnoff? I know that when I asked young people, you know, so part of our poll, we looked at, you know, about 1,400 young people under the age of 30. 80% of them, 80% felt that the two parties did not only not represent their interests, but did not represent the interest of the country. And when I asked them about them, the focus groups, they said that we need and want more information about complex issues. And the parties give us canned positions that, and they're intolerant of difference. And we're kind of sometimes in the middle, right? Or we need more objective information in everything that comes out of the party, or it's just these polarized views. And there's so many complex issues out there that young people are searching for. And we see this trend. And I'll tell you, if I was a partisan running a campaign, I would target these independent voters and figure out, you know, what are their issues and how can we convince them to join, you know, or support our candidates.
Right. We talked too about the debate just a little bit, and you were talking about kind of the canned statements, you know, and some of them can be made during a debate. For example, does a debate like what we just saw this week, does that move the needle potentially for some of these?
You know, I don't think it does for Republicans and Democrats. So I think, you know, the Republicans, Democrats came, particularly the partisans, with their popcorn, and they're going to support their candidate, even if their candidate doesn't do well. And so I don't think it's going to change minds.
They're still going to stay home. We always say to stay home.
But I do think there's a segment of the independent vote, in particular, because, you know, independents are also notoriously ticket splitters. You know, down the, you know, they may support a presidential candidate of one party and another. And what many of them are attracted to, either personality, you know, the kind of the persona of the individual, or specific policies. And that may change from election to election, and I think why we see this fluctuation.
We're looking kind of ahead, and you know, yes, we talk about this two-party system. I mean, it's been that way for a long time, and it probably, the way that it's set up is it's not beneficial to a third party.
You know, it's not, and you know, I think one, it would be hard to, you know, because people were independent doesn't necessarily mean they would actually support a party.
Right.
Look at Kristen Sinema. You know, I think perhaps her trajectory to win would to get the majority of the independent vote, and that didn't occur.
It did not.
You know, so, you know, I refer to independents as a small I, right? That they're all over the place on core issues. Immigration, gun control, the economy, you know, they don't fit the partisan lens there, so it's hard to kind of put them as part of a party. But I think to your point is how we run elections. I mean, look at the Federal Election Commission, which oversees elections in our country. It's designed to deadlock with 6 people, 3 Republicans, 3 Democrats. And that permeates all the way down to the elections. So if you have we studied all 50 states on how election participation, who can participate, and independents are excluded from the majority of places of being poll watchers.
When you talk to people at other states, from maybe other universities, for example, are they surprised? Do they even have, because I feel like people don't realize how many independents we actually have here in our state. Does that surprise some?
I think it does. I mean, I think, Gallup again is this tracking, and we've hit the high point of 51% in June. But again, because individual states have different ways of voting, and many have closed primaries, that you have to be part of a party to vote. Their registration doesn't tell the story. So they may not perhaps have an understanding of perhaps how impactful they are. But I think when we start looking at the numbers, we have to start asking the questions, why are so many Americans, and particularly young people, you touched upon veterans, that's another large group, particularly under the age of 50, that is distinctly independent. Why is this group, particularly young people, not wanting to have anything to do with the parties? And what implications does it have for the future?
Yeah, and I think many who have served overseas, particularly who were in Afghanistan and whatnot, you hear a lot of them are independents. They feel like the government kind of left them behind.
They are, they're an emerging group. Young people and veterans are 2 of the groups to watch when we look at, particularly if young people over the years continue, to stay independent. And as I said, some thought was that as millennials age, they would perhaps join parties. That's how it's been in the future. They aren't. Wow. They're staying independent. Because
eventually the boomers, they're going to be gone.
Right.
They just are.
And actually, if young people voted, I tell my young students all the time that if they voted the same rate as their boomer counterparts, they would rule the world.
Yeah. Wow. All right. Thom, thank you so much for coming.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's just fascinating stuff. Coming up, what's happening with the Valley housing market and what experts believe will happen when a rate cut is made. Welcome back to Newsmaker. On Friday, Wall Street closed with its best week of the year and a lot of anticipation that the Fed will soon cut interest rates. Many believe that will help the housing market. Tina Tamboer, a senior housing analyst with the Cromford Report, is here now to talk more about the housing market, specifically right here in the Valley. Tina, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So real quick, just remind our folks what the Cromford Report does here in the Valley.
The Cromford Report, we are a local analytical firm that we have a data license with the MLS. So we get to analyze the Phoenix metropolitan area very, very deeply. So we have proprietary data that we provide to the industry as a whole for realtors, builders, title companies, et cetera. So we're just your analytical nerds for Phoenix.
Yeah, and I mean, as far as the housing market goes, people have, frankly, been kind of sitting on the fence a little bit just because of rates. And, if you got locked in at 3.25 in 2021, for example, why on earth would you want to buy a home now if you have to put 20% down and your rate is around 7%? Is that what is kind of keeping people out?
Well, rates are actually not around 7% any longer. And that's what maybe some people may not realize because, they're going on with their lives, right? So what's happened since April is that the rates have come from a 7.5% high all the way down to 6.1%. And this is an average across the nation. Always talk to your lender because some people are getting lower rates. I talked to a first-time home buyer just last week that got their rate under 6%, and it's conventional, and you don't need to have 20% down. So that is one of those thoughts that buyers have that is not necessarily true. But the whole idea of staying in your home just because you have a 2.3 or 3% mortgage rate kind of ignores the fact that a lot of people have a significant amount of equity. So when they do sell that home, you could actually have potentially a comparable payment for a home that better meets your needs. So for some people, getting these rates down to the low 6s or even into the 5% range is enough to get them to start looking around and to start talking to their lender and seeing what their actual payments are going to be like. And so just a note too, for every 1% that rate drops right now, it's about 10% off of your principal and interest payment. So for a, say, a $300,000 to $400,000 mortgage, that's hundreds of dollars off of your payment. And, going into the 4 and 5s, you could be saving anywhere from $300 to $400 a month just from the rate drops from April to September.
For someone who wants to get in the housing market and they are that first-time home buyer, what is your advice? Because I know that, that some people are saying, well, maybe it's a better time to rent right now rather than jump in.
It depends on what your needs are. Rent versus buy, from taking an apartment rental to a single family home, you're not going to get the like for like there. Of course, it's generally an upgrade in your living experience to go from an apartment to a single family home with potentially your own driveway, or a garage, which would be amazing, right? And you get more square footage typically. A first time starter home, which is probably about 1,200 to 1,500 square feet, is right around $375,000 to $380,000 right now. So much lower than the median price. And when you start coming in with the incentives that are being offered by the builders, which have lower mortgage rates, or even some of the sellers out there right now that are offering temporary buy downs so that you get an extra 20% off your first year payment, things like that can really help ease the transition from apartment living into single family.
Talk about that buy down a little bit, because there is a discussion of, if you go to a builder, get a new home, you can buy that rate down much more than if you were to go for an existing home. What is the thought process on that, and why does maybe a home builder have an advantage when you're talking about buying down a rate?
Well, home builders are in a lot more control when it comes to the financing options and what they can afford, are willing to put out there in incentives, than a resale homeowner. They have some limitations as to what they can afford to do. However, right now, the median cost for a seller in this marketplace in the first-time home buyer range, like in that starter home range, you're looking at well over 50 to 70% of those sellers are offering about $10,000 to the buyer to help with closing costs, to help with buying down, at least temporarily or even sometimes permanently, their rate to, again, ease in on that payment. And then it gives them about 2 years to see where rates settle down so they can then eventually refinance into a permanent rate.
With the Fed, this anticipation, I mentioned Wall Street is, looking forward to this, and, everyone's excited. I mean, what does it mean for the Valley housing market? Just as a whole, do you think that is positive news? Or, I mean, you guys track just, fluctuations all the time. And, that's just the name of the game.
It's very good news for the housing market. Frankly, we have been through a 2.5-year slump already. So typically this is the beginning, if you will, of the recovery of sales for single family homes, and especially single family homes in the Valley. And those resale sellers could see some definite relief from the marketplace today. And the good news for the buyers specifically is that the prices are not moving a whole lot. They're not shooting up like some people said they would. The housing market just doesn't move that fast. So you can take advantage of the early days of lower mortgage rates before the rest of the buyers get their engines warm, if you will. And the fourth quarter is typically the best time to be the buyer seasonally in Greater Phoenix. Come springtime, everybody has a renewed hope, and that's when our peak season for buyer activity happens.
Something too that, the Valley housing market, and people always talk about, well, will those values drop? And we have not seen that.
No, we don't see, the math doesn't support any massive adjustment in price, not like what we saw in 2022, which affected mostly real estate investors who were on short-term holds, where they were buying and selling on a short-term basis. Right now, the long-term holds are doing very well. But as a seller, you do want to at least own your home for 3 to 5 years to get the full benefit before selling. But right now, the prices are a bit flat. we are not looking at massive changes on the downside. But if anything, the effects of these mortgage rates coming down will most likely improve both of our buyer analytics and our seller analytics, because not only buyers get off the fence when rates come down, but so do sellers. So if our supply goes up with demand, we can see our prices only see moderate improvements, but we will see a lot more transactions happening, a lot more people moving.
You know, during the pandemic, a number of values, especially here in the Valley, doubled. I mean, it was, a $400,000 house is now an $800,000 house, for example. Do you feel like if you are a seller now, that is unrealistic? That kind of a gain is just unrealistic in that short amount of time moving forward?
Well, not necessarily.
Oh.
I think when you look at the long-term trend lines for Greater Phoenix, if you had purchased your home in, say, 2001 and experienced a 5% annual appreciation rate all the way up till now, we would be quite close to where your property would be valued at this stage. So we were underperforming for a while. After the crash, we had to catch up to that 5% line. We overcorrected in 2022, and then we had a mild correction. Between June and December of 2022, we had a correction where prices dropped about 12 to 15% and then bounced and went flat. So right now we are on track to meet up with that 5% long-term line by just staying where we are.
The rental market is also pretty big, Airbnbs, VRBOs, and there has been some discussion nationally that, some families are maybe choosing to go to a hotel, for example, instead of choose an Airbnb. Are you hearing any rumblings about that as far as maybe this Airbnb market slowing down a little bit? Do we have too many, frankly, in like the Scottsdale area?
Well, frankly, we don't track Airbnb specifically, but I can tell you that for those operators who are choosing to list their homes, we're not showing a huge fluctuation in supply at this point. It's not a big rush to sell. I think that at this point in time, there's not any major effect of Airbnb operators closing down or choosing to sell. And from that standpoint, if you see the ROI on your Airbnb coming down or your VRBO, that might affect the sale of the entire property. But we're not seeing, again, we're not really seeing any dips in price as a direct correlation to the lack of tourism.
Yeah, so kind of what you were saying is they're playing, those owners, same thing, you got to kind of play the long game. That 3 to 5 year period is probably the best for someone who maybe does have that investment property.
Yeah, so you may have a bit of an expense if you have one of those Airbnbs, or I keep saying Airbnb, but a vacation rental. If you have one of those vacation rentals that might be ostentatious, maybe it's all pink, maybe it has a theme, you might have a little bit of expense to bring it into a more neutral space. But other than that, I think we do have the demand. It's just a matter of now having the affordability come within the grasp of many of our buyers with these most recent rate declines.
Yeah. And last question, I mean, we are going to be having, a rate cut coming, and then there could potentially be more coming. That also has to be good news too for the housing market.
It is good news, but there are a lot of economic indicators that we're going to be watching, quite frankly. There are rumors of recessions coming, and how do housing markets respond to recessions? So there's a big difference between the luxury market per se and the rest of us. And the majority of housing actually does recover during recessions because prices go flat and mortgage rates come down. But in the luxury market, they'll be tracking the stock market. So if the stock market suffers, then we might see a stall in the luxury market in the fourth quarter.
Okay. Yeah, I like how you said that. There's the luxury market, and then there's the rest of us. That's a good way to put it. Tina, thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
And we'll be right back on Newsmaker. Thanks for watching Newsmaker. I'm Ellen McNamara.